Thank you very much, Dom, for the introduction and for organizing the symposium. As Dom said, I'm a psychiatrist. I bring to this symposium the perspective of somebody who uses neuroimaging to try and understand and answer clinical questions. And so I'm a bit anxious about being in this audience. It's not my typical audience, so hopefully I will be able to just give you a different point of view and the challenge that we have to consider when we are using neuroimaging to try and answer key clinical questions. As a clinician, the first point at which I will see my patients, and I'm going to talk specifically about psychosis. And by psychosis, I mean various psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia or affective disorders that can present with affective symptoms. And that's the point when we see our patients normally. We see them when they come here. Actually, I really don't like to use the mouse as a pointer. Okay. So the point where we see our patients is here in the red circle. And when patients come to our clinics at that stage, we really don't know who is going to end up where. So you can see the green line will show where patients may end up. So they may respond very well to our treatment and improve and have no other episodes or very few episodes, or they may end up where you see the red line, where they in fact show that they are resistant to treatment and go on to develop a quite poor outcome. And the problem is when they come to our clinic, when we start treatment, we don't know who will end up where. So we've been thinking of ways to really try and predict who ends up where. And this is the results that I'm showing you here in this abstract are the ones of a large epidemiological study we did in the UK a few years ago. And here we followed up a large sample of patients that we first saw when they had the first episode of psychosis. And then we saw 10 years later, and we reconstructed their clinical course. And what you see here in the red circle is one of our main findings, which is that, in fact, those patients that end up in the following the red arrow, the one where people become treatment resistant, we can see that many of those people, in fact, are already resistant from the beginning. So there are things that we should be able to identify at the beginning of the illness to try and isolate these people and perhaps treat them differently. When we look at the other types of illness course that these patients have followed, you can see that they really varied. So some of them have never improved, and those are the ones we would call, for example, as having a continuous illness course. Some have had a very benign illness course, and they have had good periods of remissions, long periods of remission, in fact, and those are the ones that, for example, we could call episodic, and others are intermediate, so between the two types. When we look at the distribution of these, you can see that on the left column, the one where all patients are indicated, you can see that they are really distributed along these different type of illness course. So this is what we know after 10 years, but we didn't know at the beginning. And this is not just depending on diagnosis. So we have the people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, non-affective type of psychosis, that are quite really widely distributed across these different outcomes. So we should not think that just the pure diagnosis will tell us what is the more likely prognosis. Then the question is, can we use any neurobiological information to try and identify these different subtypes of patients, or in other words, to try and dissect the heterogeneity of these clinical subtypes? This is what we have tried to do in neuroimaging. This is just one of the approaches that can be used, and the one that I'm going to discuss today. This is a study that we published several years ago now that was a very promising study, because although we have used neuroimaging in kind of univariate comparisons of different patient groups, we haven't been able to use neuroimaging to inform our clinical management for the individual patient, as I'm sure you are all very familiar with, certainly not in psychosis. When we did this study, this was a study using a support vector machine approach, and what we did, we used it using the first scan, the scan acquired at the very first onset of illness in those patients that I just mentioned a minute ago. And we looked at how they went on, how their illness went on over the subsequent 6 years. And using this very basic kind of approach, we saw that we could predict with a significant accuracy those who went on to develop a continuous illness course. So this was the ones who did not have good periods of remission. And it was very exciting. But what was more interesting, particularly for me as a clinician, was the fact that the patients with who had a very benign course, the ones who had an episodic type of course, could not be distinguished from the controls. So we could not predict really who was going to have an episodic illness course. So then this says, well, then not all patients are equal, which we already know, but then the point is, how are we going to deal with the ones that are in the intermediate group? So what about the ones that do not end up in one or the other group? Then in this case, we use a slightly different approach. We thought, well, let's see if the biology can tell us how they end up. So what we did, we used the machine learning approach, and we just entered them, and we saw how they were classified by the software. And so the intermediate people were 33 patients, and 23 of these had suffered further episodes, and 10 had suffered no more episodes. And so we went on to see how they were classified, and we saw that, in fact, 74% of those that were classified as continuous had more than one episode, and 65% of the episodic only had one episode. So in this case, what we saw was that just on the basis of this biological information, well, we should say imaging data information, we could accurately predict if somebody was going to have more episodes or not. So this was very encouraging. We decided to look at earlier outcomes. And this is a more recent sample that we have been following up over the last 5 years. And in this case, we looked at whether we could use information on brain structure, brain gerrification in particular, and white matter, to see whether we could identify any difference between the brains of those who were going, in this case, to respond to medications after 12 weeks, and those who didn't. And what we found was, on the left here, you can see the results of the gerrification pattern. And what we found was that the patients who did not respond to medications after 12 weeks were the ones who showed reduced gerrification in certain brain areas that were used to see as implicated in studies of schizophrenia and psychosis. And this was brain gerrification, and when we look at, we use a different approach, we use a connectomic approach to look at how these gerrification alterations were interrelated with each other. We saw also that the network of the people who did not respond to antipsychotics was quite different and really more, well, it had a number of reduced relationship and reduced centrality of key regions compared to the network of the ones who responded to medication. But again, for me here, one of the most interesting findings was the one you can see here on the left at the bottom, which is that the people who responded to medications were not different from the controls. And the same was true for the DTI data that you can see here. On the left, you can see just a standard comparison where we found reduced fractional anisotropy altered fractional anisotropy in the ones who did not respond to medication, as well as an alteration in their network in terms of global efficiency. But again, no differences between the ones who go on to respond to medication and the healthy individuals. Then the question was, well, can we use larger data sets? So the ones I've shown you just now included 80 patients and about 50 controls. So what about using larger data sets to see if we can identify brain characteristics for those people who are likely to have a worse outcome? In this case, we involved 5 different centers that we knew had collected similar samples, so samples of patients scanned at the first episode and then followed up for the subsequent 5 to 6 years. And these are the centers here that took part in this study and that I'm glad to say we are now also part of a new consortium that Christos will tell you more about in a minute. As you can see here, we had almost 600 MRI scans. It's a large number, but the moment you have to try and use them in order to understand the heterogeneity, the biological and the clinical heterogeneity, you have to make some tough decisions. And the decisions are about what are the groups, so what are the clusters, what are the labels that you are going to use from a clinical point of view to try and identify the biological subtypes. And immediately we lost a large number of people because in these studies that used different scales to evaluate outcome, we decided to go for the 2 more extreme outcomes, so the best and the worst. And when we tried to see if using these MRI scans we could classify outcome in these various people, we saw that by using these clinical labels, really we could. And you can see here oh, probably it's too small. But anyway, the accuracy was very low, was just no more than chance. Then we decided to reduce the heterogeneity. In what way? Well, we decided to see if there was something that was less heterogeneous that we could predict. And when we tried to predict something like gender, like sex, so we tried to see if we could use these MRI scans all together to see if we could predict something like sex. Indeed, we found that we could. We could both in each individual center as well as in a model that combined data from all centers. And the heterogeneity, when we limited, for example, the sample to male only, also reduced, and in this case, even the ability to predict clinical outcome improved, although not significantly. And more recently, these are data that we are just analyzing at the moment. We use a different approach. So we went back even farther, and we saw whether we could predict not only outcome, for example, at 1 year, as in classified here as about 74 weeks after the first episode of schizophrenia, but we also went back and we tried to see whether we could predict or identify differences related to outcome at an intermediate point and at a very early point after only 4 weeks of medication. And again, what we find is that the heterogeneity is not only there, but it also takes time to settle down. So what we saw in this case, we saw again alterations in gerification, and particularly in the gerification network, differences between the ones in remission and not in remission that were only apparent at the 74-week evaluation. But they were not evident earlier on. But although interestingly, at the 22 weeks, so the intermediate evaluation, they were not significantly, but they were already present, suggesting that really the 2 groups start to differentiate certainly after the first 4 weeks of treatment. But then they need time to become established. I will skip this. So what I would like to propose is that we need to think about new ways of approaching the heterogeneity of psychosis in particular. And we need to think about different ways in how we use and we integrate the neurobiological and the clinical data, because they are both very heterogeneous. In the sample that I mentioned earlier, the ESOP 10 sample, you can see here how if we look at, for example, proportion of people who had remained symptom-free in the 2 years prior to the assessment, these varied. So 46% had remained symptom-free, which is about half, but then the other people had a very varied course. Some had no period of remission at all, and some had a remitting course. So what we would do when we try to think, for example, about looking at their brains, is to use this information and then go and compare the groups and say, okay, I want to compare the remitting with the non-remitting or with the symptom-free. And so what we'll be discussing in the next section of this symposium, and what I would like to propose, is that we need to think about this differently. We need to think about better ways to integrate the biology and the clinical labels. And we need to also move away from the clinical labels that we have used, which have not been, we have to say, particularly successful until now, and look at the biology and let also the biology tell us about the heterogeneity in clinical outcome and not just one way to that. I'm going to finish by thanking my group and thanking again the organizers of HBM for having us here.